Welcome back, everyone. Time to jump into our first lesson on the big picture concepts of working with network peering on Azure. In this lesson, we're going to start off with some requirements or some scenarios to be aware of that would call for network peering being the preferred solution, go into our big picture overview of how network peering works, break down or compare peering versus VPN, which have a lot of overlap in their end functionality, but there are some key differences to be aware of, and then we will discuss how to implement network peering within an Azure virtual network. Jumping on into it, let's think about some requirements to be aware of why we would want to care about connecting multiple virtual networks to begin with. As our Azure infrastructure grows, you may have a need to connect multiple virtual networks for a variety of reasons. For example, you may have virtual networks in multiple regions. Going back to our discussion that virtual networks are scoped to a single region, if you have infrastructure in multiple regions, you need to have a way to extend your private networking across those regions. Overall, whether working with a single region or multiple regions, you simply have a need to connect multiple virtual networks together to effectively act as a single network. And also, more importantly, you also have a need to keep all of your networking traffic on the Microsoft internal backbone and not expose it to the public internet. For all of these scenarios, not surprisingly, virtual network peering is our go-to solution. So let's talk about the initial big picture of what exactly is virtual network peering. Quite simply, it gives you the ability to privately connect multiple Azure virtual networks. Or in other words, these multiple networks can appear as one network when it comes to different connectivity purposes. And more importantly, all of that traffic between your multiple networks will remain and stay on Microsoft's private backbone. The whole private backbone concept is going to be a recurring theme. Additionally, you can get around multiple restrictions with virtual networks in which you can peer across multiple regions, and you can also peer networks across subscriptions and even across more than one tenant. Or in other words, you can extend your private networking across regions, across subscriptions, and even across tenants as well. Network peering has a few key benefits to be aware of. Once again, it allows you to extend your virtual network beyond the boundaries or the walls of a single virtual network. And again, a common recurring theme, that traffic will all stay on Microsoft's private internal backbone, which means it has lower latency or overall better performance, and that traffic is not exposed to the public internet. And from a security perspective, you have the ability to apply network security groups to segment or block certain types of traffic between networks and subnets in case you need to isolate certain networks or subnets for security purposes. Switching gears, I now want to compare two methods of connecting virtual networks together in which we are comparing network peering versus VPN. Now, what is interesting is that both have the same end result in which you are privately connecting two virtual networks together, even though VPN also has the ability to connect to on-premises locations. However, there are some key differences that you need to know. Starting off with peering, one of the key differences is that peered traffic does not have encryption between those networks. The main idea is that since all traffic is on Microsoft's private backbone, the traffic between those networks can be trusted. Second difference, as I just mentioned, once again, that traffic does stay on Microsoft's backbone. Again, that is a key difference that is going to keep coming up. From a performance and management perspective, network peering does not require a virtual network gateway to manage traffic, which has a couple of key benefits. One is that there is less hops or links between network, and you also have lower latency overall, again because of less hops or links in the chain. Also, since we are not going through a virtual network gateway, which requires you to select a SKU with a maximum possible bandwidth, you are able to get the maximum bandwidth possible between virtual networks without having to go through a virtual network gateway as a gatekeeper. And overall, compared to VPN, network peering is less expensive and there is simply less for you to have to manage. So higher performance, lower cost, and a lot easier to manage is really the main benefits of network peering. With that said, there are key differences working with VPN, which also has a few benefits as well. One of the biggest benefits of using VPN, especially between virtual networks, is that it encrypts traffic between networks. However, it does involve routing traffic over the public internet, even if we are simply linking two virtual networks together. Also, compared to network peering that does not have a gateway that's managing traffic, not surprisingly, VPN does have a virtual network gateway that does manage your traffic, which means you are a lot more limited to the overall maximum bandwidth, and there are more hops or links in the chain between your virtual networks. Now, despite these performance downsides, one scenario that does favor VPN is that for security and compliance requirements that require encryption between networks, VPN is a better solution for that specific use case. Overall, however, compared to using network peering outside of the security and compliance aspect, using VPN via a virtual network gateway has higher costs, overall less performance, and there is a lot more that you need to manage. Next, let's go through the initial overview of how to implement network peering on an Azure virtual network. Like many of our other services, it is a relatively straightforward process regardless of if you're using the Azure portal or using command line. Overall, the process is step 1, take 2 existing Azure virtual networks and create a peering link from one network over to the other. If you're using the portal, this peering link is accomplished within the settings of the virtual network itself, from which there are a number of different peering options that you need to configure, one of which is choosing to allow traffic to go to and from the remote network. It is entirely possible to create a peering link in which traffic can only flow one direction. By default, though, it does allow traffic flowing in both directions, both from your network to the peered network and vice versa, although you do have the ability to change this. The other main configuration option is choosing whether or not you can utilize a virtual network gateway in the remote network, which can include allowing a peered network to use a virtual network gateway in your own network or vice versa, and we are going to talk about network gateway configurations in more detail in a later lesson. Next step in the process is to create the same peering link from the remote or peered network back to your host network, although by default, assuming you have control over both virtual networks, both of those peering links are created in the same step, although it certainly is not required. Overall, when working with network peering and any other extension of connectivity, one golden rule you must always remember is that the network address spaces in your multiple virtual networks must not overlap. This is going to be a recurring rule regardless of working with peering, VPN, or any other options that extend connectivity from your network to any other network. With that, that's going to go ahead and wrap up this initial conceptual overview of working with network peering. There is a lot more details to talk about. However, let's quickly review our key takeaways before we move on. We started off with a big picture of network peering, in which we learned how network peering will connect multiple virtual networks specifically over Microsoft's private backbone, which gives you the ability to, among other benefits, extend your private networking across Microsoft Azure regions. We then compared peering versus VPN, which both connect virtual networks, although some key differences is that peering is overall much more simple, faster, and more private. However, VPN allows you to encrypt traffic between networks, although at the expense of interacting with the public internet. With that said, VPN could be a preferred option when it comes to meeting compliance requirements. And then we finish up with the initial overview of how to implement peering, in which we simply create a peering in our virtual network settings, configure traffic access between your host and your peered or remote network, and we have to complete that peering step in both directions from one network to another, although by default this is all accomplished in the same step, assuming that you have access to both virtual networks. That's going to go ahead and wrap up this lesson. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one.